Welcome to the official podcast of Business Times Zimbabwe, where we will be redefining business and exploring the forces that are shaping our economy, our future, and our culture. Every week, we will bring to you fresh perspectives through in-depth interviews, roundtable discussions, and sharp commentary on the issues that matter most to Zimbabweans at home and abroad. So whether you're a young professional, an entrepreneur, or part of the diaspora, this is your space to stay informed, inspired, and connected. Let's talk. Good day and welcome to the first episode of the Business Times Zimbabwe podcast. I am your host, Tatenda Madondo, and I'm looking forward to engaging in this conversation with you today. Today's topic is actually a very, very special one because we will actually be taking it all the way to the very beginning, and we will be taking a journey through Zimbabwe's economic history. And I don't just mean the usual story of inflation or land reform. We're going to be going a lot deeper, from the systems of trade before colonial rule, through the upheavals of colonization, all the way to what is happening now. By the end, we hope that you'll have a better sense of how Zimbabwe's past has shaped its economy. Here at Business Times, we're of the belief that in order to understand how and why things are the way they are, it's important to go back to its origin point. You see, context is everything, and it's only when we have an understanding of how things started that we're able to not only analyze it in a more objective manner, but then we're also able to draw lessons from that and say, okay, what worked, what didn't, and what is the argument and intention behind the state of society and what we're seeing right now on a political, business, and even economic level. And in a country like Zimbabwe, it can be very easy to think that Zimbabwe's history starts with colonization, when in reality, there was so much happening even before colonialism took place in Zimbabwe. And that is where I'd like us to start from today. So let's start way back before colonialism. Zimbabwe wasn't an isolated land. In fact, it was home to thriving kingdoms, for example, the Kingdom of Mapungubwe, and later on the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe. And these societies were not just farming communities either. They were economic powerhouses of their time. Agriculture was the backbone, so much so actually that the likes of maize became staples and remains a staple in Zimbabwe even to this day. But here's the fascinating part. They didn't just produce food for themselves. Surpluses were traded at that time. So for example, gold, cattle, and ivory became very big economic drivers in Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe was actually part of the wider networks that reached as far as the Swahili coast and even Asia. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain and Persian glass beads in Great Zimbabwe, proving just how connected this region was to international trade. So in short, pre-colonial Zimbabwe had a very balanced economy, farming for survival, cattle as a store of wealth, and also long-distance trade for growth. But when we fast forward to the late 1800s, that's when we see the colonial disruption and all of the changes that brought. The British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rhodes, moved in. And suddenly land wasn't just land anymore. It became property under colonial law. And Africans were pushed off fertile areas into what were known as reserves at that time. Colonial economics was very extractive by its design. So, for example, mining took center stage, gold, copper, asbestos, and later even tobacco farming. However, these industries were not actually built to benefit the local Zimbabwean people. Profits flowed outward to Europe while Africans were forced into low-wage labor. Heavy taxes were also made sure that men left their homes to work in mines and farms that were owned by the settlers. And so by the mid-20th century, Rhodesia had developed strong infrastructure and industries, but it was incredibly unequal. White settlers controlled the most productive land and businesses, while African communities, obviously in this case the Zimbabwean communities, carried the burden of the labor with very little reward. And herein comes 1980. Zimbabwe gains independence, and the new government had very, very big ambitions to expand education, healthcare, and land access. And, in many ways, the early years were very promising. Zimbabwe invested heavily in schools and health services, and literacy rates climbed. As it stands, Zimbabwe still has one of the highest English literacy rates in all of Africa, with, if I'm not mistaken, 90% of the Zimbabwean population being literate in the English language on a fluent level. But to go back to the early days of a free Zimbabwe, the economy still leaned on colonial structures, commercial farming and mining to be specific. Land reform became the next big question during this time, and for years redistribution of land was actually quite slow and voluntary, But by the late 1990s, there was a very evident growing frustration. War veterans, political pressure, and economic struggles actually pushed the government at the time toward a fast-track land reform, with land seizures that rapidly transferred land from white farmers to black Zimbabweans. And while this did reshape the economy, it also disrupted production. And so agriculture, which was once the country's strongest sector, ended up taking a major hit. By the 2000s, Zimbabwe was in freefall. International sanctions, poor harvests, political instability, and the collapse of commercial agriculture combined into a perfect storm. By 2008, hyperinflation had hit its peak, with prices doubling on an almost daily basis. Just to give you some perspective for those that are not familiar with the 2008 era of Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe actually printed a $100 trillion note. In short, the formal economy shrank, and many Zimbabweans ended up turning towards the informal sector, cross-border trade, and remittances from family members abroad. It was survival economy at its rawest and purest form. By 2009, Zimbabwe had actually abandoned its own currency and switched to the US dollar and the South African rand. And for a while, stability had actually returned. The shops restocked and businesses restarted, and people were beginning to build trust in money again. But as time went on, new challenges appeared. Cash shortages, reintroduction of a local currency, and continued struggles with inflation. Today, Zimbabwe's economy is a mix of contradictions. Agriculture is recovering in some areas, especially tobacco production. Mining is still a major source of foreign currency, with gold and platinum leading the way. But unemployment also remains very high, and many Zimbabweans survive through informal work or small businesses. Meanwhile, the diaspora actually plays a very massive role. Remittances from South Africa, the UK, and beyond inject billions into the economy each year. That money keeps families afloat and drives local business activity. And so, to recap, before colonialism, Zimbabwe had vibrant trade and agriculture. During colonialism, the economy was structured for extraction and inequality in favor of the white minority. And after independence, big reforms reshaped the land, but also triggered deep crises. And today, the economy continues to balance between recovery and hardship. It's a story of resilience, adaptation, and constant change. And while the challenges are many, Zimbabwe's history also shows a remarkable ability to reinvent itself in the face of difficulty. So the question now is, where do we go from here? As we look ahead, what are some of the lessons that we've learned from this, and what are the pathways for growth, not only for Zimbabwe's economy, but also within the morale of, the Zimbabwean people, because the economy of a country is always felt most by its people before anything else. And so where do we go from here? Zimbabwe's economic story is still being written. And so a lot of the lessons of history provide a compass for what lies ahead for us. One of the clearest lessons that we've learned is that resilience alone is simply just not enough. It is crucial that we pair it with a deliberate strategy and a long-term vision. From the pre-colonial era, we learned a lot about the value of trade networks and diversified economies. Great Zimbabwe thrived not only because of gold, but also because it combined farming, cattle, and long-distance trade. That lesson reminds us today that we cannot depend on just one sector. So whether it's agriculture, mining, or remittances, it is important that we diversify the sectors that the economy relies on to survive. Sustainable future requires a diversified economy that connects Zimbabwe to regional and global markets the way that it was before. And even when we look into colonialism actually taught us a lot, especially about the dangers of exclusion. When the majority are left out of meaningful economic participation, inequality can fester and then unrest follows. Modern Zimbabwe has to remember and must ensure that growth includes broad participation, whether it is empowering women, youth, rural communities, and entrepreneurs. Inclusion is not just a moral choice. It is an economic engine. There are very few countries that are able to survive when large groups of people are marginalized and disenfranchised. Because as we saw with colonialism, even when Rhodesia, in quotes, was at its peak, it very quickly fell apart after colonization, because when exclusion is the mainstay of an economy, you begin to see the negative effects of that shortly after. But with that being said, the independence years also showed us the power of investing in people. Expansions in education and healthcare in the 1980s created one of Africa's most literate populations. Even during economic crises, Zimbabweans have demonstrated talent and skill across the world. It's not without a reason that Zimbabwean labor is very much valued in economies outside of Zimbabwe. The challenge now, however, is to create an environment where that human capital can actually flourish at home through stable policies, support for innovation, and access to finance. The era of land reform and hyperinflation underscored the importance of policy stability and trust. Economies rely on confidence, whether it's confidence in the currency, in contracts, or in governance. And so rebuilding trust between government, business, and citizens is very important. It's probably perhaps one of the single most important steps towards a lasting and sustainable economy, especially lasting recovery from, the dent that Zimbabwe took in the 2000s. And looking forward, opportunities exist in agriculture modernization, value addition in mining, renewable energy, and the digital economy. Our diaspora is also another strength because beyond remittances, it represents a global network of skills, ideas, and investment potential, all of which can make Zimbabwe thrive should the priorities be rearranged to focus on bringing that back home, back to the land of Zimbabwe. Ultimately, Zimbabwe's growth will depend on finding balance, whether it's between tradition and innovation, between local needs and global opportunities, and between stability and reform. If we embrace inclusivity, if we nurture our human capital, and if we maintain consistent, transparent policies, the future need not be a repetition of past crises at all. Instead, it can actually be a story of not just recovery, but also renewal, where the existing resilience is matched by progress and where Zimbabwe can once again take its place as a leading economy in Africa. It's not without a reason that we were known as the breadbasket for Africa for a very long time, and it wasn't just because of colonization. Something that I strongly believe is that colonialism is not what makes a good economy. It is good priorities and good policy and an investment in the human capital and in the people. That is what makes a lasting, leading economy. And I definitely believe Zimbabwe can go back to that. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this gave you a richer understanding of where Zimbabwe's economy has come from and where it might go next. This is actually the end now of this first episode. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us. We hope that this was as informative for you as it was for us when we were researching. And we're very excited about the next episode where we will be discussing the future of artificial intelligence in Africa, the good, the bad, the ugly, the unknown, the terrifying cosmos, and a lot more. I am your host of this podcast, Tatenda Madondo. Thank you for joining us and listening to us at Business Times Zimbabwe, and we look forward to the next conversation. Have a very good day.